The two issues I deal with the most are deglobalization and depopulation. So first, deglobalization. We do not have a history of trade as a species until really 1945. We had a series of competing imperial systems before that went after resources and labor and markets and everything, but they kept everything in-house. That ultimately generated the World Wars and World War II. At the end of the war, the Americans proposed that they would use their navy so that everyone could go anywhere at any time and interface with any market, partner with any foreign country, participate in any supply chain, and the United States would open its market if in exchange everyone would line up shoulder to shoulder, not behind us or with us, but in front of us to absorb any ammo that happened to come in from the Soviet Union. We purchased an alliance to fight the Cold War. That's globalization. It was always a security plan for the Americans, not an economic one. And so in the last 7 elections since the Cold War ended, we've elected more and more isolationist and populist presidents, and Biden is the culmination of that. He is more populist and he is more or less of a globalist than even Trump was. This isn't an aberration, this is a trend. Second, depopulation. Normally you have a lot of babies and then fewer children, fewer teenagers, fewer young adults, fewer mature adults, and fewer retirees. Normally, if you stack it all up, you get a pyramid. Well, when the United States allowed global trade, everyone could access all the capital and technologies and resources of the world. So the whole world started to industrialize at a breakneck pace. And when you industrialize, you move to town. And so on the farm, kids are free labor. In town, they're just really, really expensive pets. You do this for 75 years, and we now have a good chunk of the world, the advanced world, that has more people in their 60s than their 50s, than their 40s, than their 30s, than their 10s, and so on. And even in the developing world, that process is well past the point of no return because it happened even faster in places like Brazil or India. So we've always known that the 2020s were the decade when we have a demographic bust globally that is irreparable and irrecoverable. This was always coming. It's been coming ever since the Gen X was born, because everywhere in the world, Gen Xers are smaller than the boomers, and in most of the world, the millennials are even smaller, and so on. You add depopulation to deglobalization, and the very future of trade, period, has to change. The concept of global complex supply chains goes away. The idea of a single price for oil goes away. The idea that we can feed 8 billion people goes away. So the end of the world is just the beginning. It's about what's on the backside of this. And we are... Trump sped things up a little bit. Biden sped them up more. COVID really did a number on it. And the Ukraine war is a hard stop. So the old era is already gone. The leading wave was always going to be one of two sectors: energy, because it's so sensitive to disruptions and demand is inelastic. And we're on the leading edge of seeing that. We haven't gotten there quite yet. I'm expecting the majority of Russian oil to just fall off the market within the next couple of months, and then we'll be there. And then the other one is manufacturing, because supply chains are so complicated and complex. And we started seeing that 3 years ago, actually, with COVID and with the rising trade tensions with the Chinese. We now have the Chinese actively panicking about supply chains because they can't not do COVID lockdowns because their vaccine doesn't work. And they're now realize that they've had 2 American presidents back to back that are hyper populist, and everything that Trump said he was going to do, Biden is actually turning into policy. So that decoupling we've started musing about a few years ago is happening at light speeds now, and the companies that were unable or unwilling or just didn't believe it during COVID and refused to diversify or reshore things back to North America, they're so screwed because now we're at that point demographically where the baby boomers are retiring, and that's taking our biggest chunk of skilled labor with them. So we knew that labor costs had to go up when the baby boomers retired. Having to go through a reshoring process of this scale at the same time was always going to be a heavy carry, but it's so much better here than everywhere else. Where does this take us? Well, for the United States, this broadly works out. The United States is a net exporter of oil, and while we will absolutely have to retool some of our refineries and the price balances we're used to for refined products is going to shift, we can get through this because we're going to be doing it in an environment of a saturated market. We don't use a lot of Russian crude. We never did. And refineries have been moving bit by bit in this direction for 15 years because of the shale revolution anyway, to run on what is local. So we'll be okay there. We're the world's largest exporter of foodstuffs. We'll be okay there. And we're in the Western Hemisphere, which is largely, maybe immune's not the right word, but certainly heavily resistant and atypical compared to the Eastern Hemisphere in terms of population structures and trade patterns and resource access. So the United States will have some bumps on the way, but 5 years from now, we're going to be in a better place than we are now with a more stable supply chain system. Getting here, from here to there, it'll be awkward at times. Everybody else is so screwed, though. The primary source of income for East Asia is manufacturing. And a lot of that's going to go away because the East Asian countries don't have sufficient numbers of 20-somethings and 30-somethings and early 40-somethings, the people who consume, to buy what they produce. So when those supply chains relocate, there's nothing left. There's no oil. The agricultural options are very thin. The Chinese import 85% of their oil. 85% of that comes from the Persian Gulf, and the United States is no longer there to keep the lines open. They import 85% of the stuff that allows them to feed their population, so they're looking down famine. The story is different based on where you are. But this 70-year period we've been in, where it almost seems like hyper-growth and hyper-technological advancement, because it has been that way, that stops now. Tech development requires scads of young workers who are very bright, the ability to connect them all, and scads of capital to pay for the research, the operationalization, and the implementation. Once the baby boomers retire, the money goes away. And as deglobalization breaks, those connections among workforces goes away. So Silicon Valley will still be there, but it won't have the global network that it's used to. So everything is going to slow down. For a modern economy, food's at the bottom, then agriculture, then industrial materials, then you get into things like manufacturing and finance. And if you don't have all of that, the tech doesn't happen. Tech is something that is added on top that does not function if you don't have energy or food or manufacturing. You're the expert when it comes to price points for convoys. From a technical and a legal point of view, I certainly agree that those are going to be the first ones. Cost competitive with rail, ooh, that's tough. I mean, your average rail line can take 6,000 containers. So to be able to replace that with trucks, I'm going to call that a little squishy. I don't know one way or the other. So the changes for that would happen in places that are relatively not flat. You can't build rail lines to transport large amounts of cargo where the slope is any more than 1%. So the competitive advantage you'd be seeing for trucks are going to be in places that are already have to be truck-centric. I would expect the country where that could potentially benefit the most is going to be Mexico. I will underline that in that scenario, you're going to have some very interesting evolutions in the cartels. In the United States, not so much, because either you're in California where the traffic is too bad for convoys, or you're in the Midwest where rail and water works better. I would expect. I mean, we're talking here about a transformation of distribution systems for this to happen, and I'm not saying that can't happen. I'm not saying that's not going to happen. But in the future, I see manufacturing going to be co-located with population centers with a lot more custom on-demand manufacturing. And in that sort of an environment, convoys don't make a lot of sense. So you're talking relatively long haul from point distribution to point sourcing. We understand oil. We know we have to deal with Iraq and Iran and Venezuela and Russia. It's a supply chain that's awkward and painful sometimes, but we understand it. If you want to move to EV, you have to replace the oil supply chain system with 13 more. And we have to deal with 60 countries instead of 5. And if we lose access to any of them, the whole thing collapses. So in a deglobalized world, EVs in the way you're thinking cannot happen. But assuming the numbers work out, we are talking about a different sort of manufacturing system. that again has co-location between population centers and where the manufacturing is actually done. In that scenario, you're talking about the number of ton freight miles being reduced by in excess of 95%. So I'm not saying what you're saying is wrong. I'm saying you can't use any of the data we have for our current distribution system to apply that to that model, because that model fundamentally obliviates the old system.